Kira stood at the edge of the crystal cliff, watching the human ships descend through the purple clouds of her homeworld, and her expression showed nothing but pure disgust as the metal vessels grew larger in the sky and beside her two dragons lay coiled in the soft grass, sensing their master's emotions through the bond they shared since hatching. And Ember, the red dragon with scales like burning coals, lifted his massive head and growled low, while Frost, the silver dragon, with eyes like frozen stars, flicked her tail in agitation because they both knew their master hated what was coming. The Elven Council had debated for months about allowing humans to establish a presence on their world, and Kira had voted against it every single time, but the Galactic Treaty demanded that all member species maintain diplomatic outposts on each other's primary planets, and so despite her protests, and despite the protests of many other elves who shared her views, the humans were coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She watched the first ship touch down in the valley below, sending up clouds of dust that marred the perfect landscape, and more ships followed, landing in formation with their engines roaring loud enough to disturb the peaceful silence that had existed here for thousands of years. And Kira felt her jaw tighten as the landing ramps extended, and the first humans began to emerge from their vessels, looking small and fragile in their bulky spacesuits. Humans were a young species barely having achieved interstellar travel 500 years ago, while her people had been exploring the cosmos for over 50,000 years, and they lived such short lives, rarely reaching even 150 years, while elves lived for millennia, with Kira herself having seen 3,000 summers come and go, and they had no natural magic, no connection to the fundamental forces that bound the universe together, and instead, they relied entirely on their primitive technology to accomplish what elves could do with a simple thought. The first human to approach her position was a male wearing the uniform of their stellar navy, with insignia that marked him as some kind of officer, and he climbed the path to the cliff with obvious difficulty, because the gravity on the elven homeworld was slightly higher than what humans evolved in, and he was breathing hard by the time he reached the top, even though the climb was not particularly challenging. "Lieutenant Kyle Matthews," he said, extending his hand in that curious human gesture of greeting, "and I am honored to meet you and serve as liaison between our peoples." And his voice carried that typical human accent that Kira found grating to her sensitive ears. She did not take his hand, and instead she turned away from him, letting Ember rise to his full height of nearly 20 feet, and the dragon spread his wings wide, casting a shadow over the human, and growled again, this time showing rows of teeth, each as long as a human forearm, and Kyle, to his credit, did not run, though she could smell the fear coming off him in waves. "You are not welcome here," Kira said in perfect human standard, though she hated speaking their crude language, "and this is sacred ground, and you defile it with your presence and your machines." Kyle lowered his hand slowly, and she heard him take a breath before responding. "And I understand your concerns, and we will do everything in our power to minimize our impact on your world, and we are here in peace and friendship." "Friendship?" Kira laughed, and the sound was cold and sharp like ice breaking. "And what friendship could exist between your kind and mine? And you are children playing with forces you do not understand, and your entire civilization is younger than I am, and you have nothing to offer us except noise and chaos." She mounted Ember in one fluid motion, and Frost took to the air beside them as the red dragon launched from the cliff, and Kyle stumbled backward from the force of the wind generated by their wings, and Kira did not look back as they soared away from the landing site, and away from the humans who thought they belonged on her world. Over the following weeks, the human settlement grew, and Kira watched from a distance as they constructed their buildings using machines and manual labor that seemed painfully slow compared to elven magic, and sometimes she would fly overhead deliberately low, so the wind from her dragon's wings would scatter their materials and disrupt their work, and she took satisfaction in their frustrated shouts. The other elves mostly avoided the humans as well, though a few of the younger ones showed curiosity about the newcomers, but Kira made her opinions known, loudly and frequently in council meetings and in casual conversations, and she argued that allowing humans here was a mistake that would lead to problems, and she pointed out their crude manners, their loud voices, their complete lack of grace and refinement. Kyle tried to speak with her several more times, always polite, always respectful, but she dismissed him each time with barely concealed contempt, and once she even had Frost freeze the ground around him, trapping his boots in ice just to demonstrate how far below her he truly was, and he had worked for nearly an hour to free himself while she watched from above laughing. The human settlement eventually included about 200 people, all working on various diplomatic and scientific projects, and they set up their prefabricated structures in neat rows with their bright lights that stayed on even during the night hours, and the noise from their generators and vehicles carried across the valley, disturbing the natural sounds of the forest. Kira made a habit of visiting the ancient grove near the human settlement, and she would sit there with her dragons meditating and communing with the world spirit. And from there she could see the humans going about their daily activities, and she would shake her head at their inefficiency, at the way they struggled with tasks that would be simple for any elf child. One afternoon she was in the grove when she heard human voices approaching, and she considered leaving, but decided she was there first and they could find somewhere else to walk. And through the trees she saw Kyle and two other humans whose names she did not care to learn. They were talking about their work, about the studies they were conducting on local plant life, and Kyle mentioned how beautiful the world was and how honored he felt to be there, and one of the others agreed, saying they should learn everything they could from the elves, because clearly they had achieved something. Humanity was still striving toward. Kira felt a slight surprise at hearing that, because most species who were less advanced refused to admit it, but she quickly dismissed the feeling, because empty words meant nothing, and actions were what mattered. And the humans' actions showed. They were disruptive and disrespectful. They noticed her then, and Kyle raised his hand in greeting, but she simply stared at him with cold eyes until all three humans became uncomfortable and changed direction to walk away from the grove, and Ember rumbled with satisfaction, and Frost nuzzled against Kira affectionately, because the dragons took their emotional cues from her, and if she hated the humans, then they did too. That night, Kira attended a council meeting where the elders discussed various matters of state, and near the end Kyle was permitted to address the council with a request, and he asked if the humans could participate in the upcoming Festival of Stars, which was a sacred elven celebration that happened once every decade. The audacity of the request stunned everyone into silence, and then several council members began speaking at once, most of them angry that a human would dare ask to participate in their holy festival. And Kira stood, and her voice cut through the chaos. Absolutely not, she declared. And the Festival of Stars is for our people alone, and it celebrates traditions that existed long before humans crawled out of whatever primitive ocean spawned them, and allowing them to participate would be a desecration. Other elves voiced their agreement, and Kyle stood there accepting their anger with quiet dignity. And when the outcry died down, he simply nodded and said he understood and apologized for any offense, and would withdraw the request. But as he left the chamber, Kira saw something in his expression that troubled her, though she could not identify what it was. And it looked almost like sadness, but also acceptance, as if he had expected rejection, but hoped for something different. And she pushed the thought away, because what did it matter what emotions a human felt? The humans were nothing, and they would always be nothing, and the sooner they accepted their place in the universe, the better it would be for everyone. The weeks passed, and Kira continued her routine of avoiding the humans, except when she wanted to demonstrate her superiority, and she would fly low over their settlement with Ember and Frost flanking her, and the downdraft from 3 pairs of massive wings would send their papers flying and sometimes knock over their equipment, and she could hear their annoyed shouts, but she did not care because they were intruders on her world. One morning she was practicing aerial combat maneuvers with her dragons over the eastern mountains, and the 3 of them moved through the sky like dancers, with Ember breathing streams of fire, and Frost creating beautiful patterns of ice crystals that glittered in the sunlight, and Kira directed them with subtle mental commands through the bond they shared, and they responded instantly to her thoughts. She pushed them through a complex spiral dive and then pulled up sharply, and both dragons followed perfectly, and as they climbed back to altitude, she felt the rush of joy that always came from flying. And this was what made life worth living, and this perfect connection with her bonded companions, and the freedom of the endless sky. Below she noticed movement near one of the mountain caves, and she directed Ember to circle lower so she could investigate, and what she saw made her lip curl in contempt, because Kyle and several other humans were setting up some kind of equipment near the cave entrance, and they appeared to be taking readings or measurements of the rock formations. She landed nearby with enough force to crack the stone beneath Ember's claws, and the humans jumped in surprise, and one of them dropped the device he was holding, and it clattered down the mountainside, and Frost landed on the opposite side of the cave entrance, effectively trapping the humans between two dragons. "What are you doing here?" Kira demanded. "And these mountains are restricted areas, and you have no permission to be here." Kyle stepped forward, holding up his hands in a placating gesture, and we filed the proper requests with the council, and we received authorization to conduct geological surveys in this sector, and we are simply collecting data on the mineral compositions. Kira felt a flash of anger because she had not been at the council meeting where this must have been approved, and the elders sometimes made decisions without full attendance, and this was exactly the kind of thing she would have voted against. "Your presence disturbs the natural balance," she said, "and these caves are home to crystal formations that have grown for millions of years, and your instruments could damage them." Kyle nodded, "And that is exactly why we are being so careful and see. We are using non-invasive scanning technology that does not require us to enter the caves at all, and we want to study the formations, not harm them. And actually we were hoping to learn how they grow so perfectly, because we have nothing like this on human worlds." One of the other humans, a woman with her hair tied back, stepped forward, and her name badge read Lisa Park, and she said, "We think understanding these crystal formations could help us develop better medical technology, and the way they channel and store energy is unlike anything we have seen. And if we could replicate even a fraction of their properties, it might help us treat diseases that currently have no cure." Kira studied them for a long moment, and their equipment did appear to be non-invasive, and they had stayed outside the cave entrance as they claimed, and she could see the genuine curiosity and respect in their expressions, especially in Lisa, who was looking at the cave opening with something close to reverence. Still, she refused to show any approval, and just because the council permitted this does not mean I agree with it, and you will stay out of the caves themselves. And if I find even the smallest crystal out of place, I will personally ensure you are removed from this world." She remounted Ember and took off without waiting for a response, and as they climbed back to altitude, she found herself thinking about what Lisa had said about medical technology and diseases with no cure, and she tried to dismiss it as manipulation, but the words stuck in her mind anyway. That evening, Kira visited her friend Theron, who was one of the oldest elves on the planet, having lived for nearly 8,000 years, and his wisdom was respected by everyone, and she found him in his garden, tending to plants that bloomed only once per century. "You seem troubled, young one," Theron said without looking up from his work. "And what weighs on your mind?" "The humans," Kira answered, "sitting on a stone bench, and they are everywhere now and conducting surveys and studies, and I do not understand why the council permits it." Theron carefully trimmed a silver leaf before responding, "And perhaps the council sees value in their presence that you do not." "They have no value," Kira said flatly, "and they are primitive and short-lived, and they possess no magic, and what could we possibly learn from them?" The old elf finally looked at her, and his eyes held a depth of experience that made even Kira feel young. "And you speak of them as if they are less than us, but tell me, what do you actually know about humans beyond your assumptions?" "I know enough," Kira replied, but even as she said it, she realized it was not true, and she knew they had short lives and relied on technology and were loud and disruptive. But beyond that, what did she really know about them? Theron returned his attention to his plants, and thousands of years ago, our people were not so different from what humans are now, and we struggled and learned and grew, and we made mistakes, and we were loud and chaotic and disruptive to the older species who came before us. That is different," Kira protested, "and we always had magic, and we always had grace." "Did we," Theron asked, or did we develop those qualities over time, and did the older species look at us the way you now look at humans? And I remember stories from my own youth of elven warriors who were crude and violent, and of conflicts that nearly destroyed our entire civilization. And we are refined now because we had time to become so." Kira wanted to argue, but she respected Theron too much to dismiss his words outright, and she sat in silence watching him work and thinking about what he had said. The next day, she decided to observe the humans more carefully, not to mock them, but to understand them. And she positioned herself in a tree overlooking their settlement, using a simple invisibility spell to hide her presence, and Ember and Frost waited nearby, ready to come if she called. She watched Kyle and his team go about their daily routines, and they worked together efficiently, helping each other with tasks and sharing their food during breaks. And she noticed how they laughed frequently and told stories and seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company, despite the difficult conditions of living on an alien world. Lisa Park was conducting experiments with plant samples, and Kira watched her work with meticulous care, documenting everything and treating even the smallest specimens with respect. And when a gust of wind knocked over several of her sample containers, Lisa spent hours carefully collecting and resorting everything, refusing to take shortcuts. Another human named Danny Rivera was attempting to learn the Elven language, and he sat with a computer tablet practicing pronunciation, and his accent was terrible, and he frequently made mistakes that changed the meanings of words entirely. But he kept trying, patiently repeating phrases over and over. Jake Morrison was working on repairs to one of their generators, and Kira watched him struggle with a particularly difficult component for over an hour, and his hands were covered in grease, and he was clearly frustrated, but he did not give up. And when he finally got the part to fit properly, his smile of triumph was genuine and unguarded. Amy Chen was writing something on her tablet, and from her position Kira could see it was a letter, and Amy wrote about how beautiful the Elven world was, and how she hoped to make friends with the local people, and how honored she felt to be part of the first real diplomatic mission between their species. Kira found herself surprised by what she was seeing, because these humans were not the mindless primitives she had assumed, and they worked hard and cared about their tasks and treated her world with respect, even when they thought no one was watching, and they supported each other and showed kindness and patience. That evening, Kyle noticed one of the younger humans sitting alone, looking sad, and Kyle went over and sat beside him, and they talked for a long time, and Kira could not hear what they said, but she saw the younger human eventually smile and nod and shake Kyle's hand gratefully. She left her hiding spot feeling confused, because everything she had believed about humans was being challenged by what she had observed, and she did not like having her certainty questioned. But she also could not deny what she had seen with her own eyes. Ember sensed her confusion and nuzzled against her gently, and Frost wrapped her tail around Kira's waist comfortingly, and together they flew back to her dwelling as the twin moons rose over the horizon. Kira spent the next few days thinking about what she had observed, and she found herself flying over the human settlement more frequently, though now she stayed at a higher altitude and watched, rather than trying to disrupt their work. And Ember and Frost seemed puzzled by this change in behavior, but they trusted their bond with her and followed her lead without question. She noticed patterns in the human routines, and how they structured their days with regular work periods and break times, and meal times, and they had created a small garden where they were attempting to grow vegetables from earth, and Lisa Park spent her free time there carefully tending the plants, even though most of them were struggling in the alien soil one afternoon. Kira saw Kyle and Danny carrying supplies up the mountain path toward a weather monitoring station the humans had established at higher elevation, and the load looked heavy, and the path was steep, and she watched them stop several times to rest and encourage each other. And it took them nearly 3 hours to reach the station when an elf could have simply levitated the supplies there in minutes. But there was something in their determination that struck her, and they did not complain about the difficulty, and they did not take shortcuts, and they simply did the work that needed doing with steady persistence. And when they finally reached the top, both of them sat down exhausted but smiling, and they shared water from a canteen and looked out over the valley, clearly appreciating the view. The next day, the council called an emergency meeting, and Kira attended immediately, sensing something was wrong, and when the elders gathered, the chief elder stood with an expression of grave concern and announced that they had received a priority alert from the Galactic Defense Network. An unknown hostile force had been detected moving through their sector of space, and the chief elder explained, and multiple colonies have gone silent over the past week, and we do not know who they are or what they want. But the pattern suggests they are moving in our direction. How long until they reach us? Another council member asked. The projections suggest 3 days, perhaps 4. The chief elder replied, and we are sending for reinforcements from our fleet, but they are currently engaged in exercises in the outer systems, and it will take time for them to return. What about defenses? Kira asked, and we have the planetary shields and the defense platforms. The chief elder nodded, but his expression remained troubled, and yes, we have those. But reports from the colonies that were attacked suggest these invaders have weapons we have not encountered before, and technology that can penetrate standard defensive shields, and we must prepare for the possibility of ground combat. The meeting continued for hours as they discussed strategies and evacuation plans and defense protocols. And near the end, someone mentioned the humans and asked whether they should be evacuated immediately or if they could contribute to the defense efforts. They should leave, Kira said immediately. And they have no magic, and their weapons are primitive, and they would only be in the way during a real conflict. But Kyle had been permitted to observe the council meeting as part of his diplomatic duties, and he stood and asked permission to speak, and the chief elder granted it with a nod. "We may not have magic," Kyle said, and his voice was steady and confident, but we have fought wars for our entire history, and we understand combat and tactics and defense, and if you will permit it, we would like to help defend this world, and our ship has weapons, and our people are trained soldiers, and we will not abandon you when danger comes. Several council members laughed at this, and one of them said, "Your weapons cannot even scratch our training drones, and what use would they be against a real enemy?" Kyle did not seem offended by the mockery. "And perhaps you are right," said, "but we are here and we are willing to fight, and sometimes numbers matter, even if individual strength is limited. And at minimum, we can help with evacuations and medical support and logistics." The council debated this and ultimately decided to allow the humans to remain and assist with non-combat roles, and Kira voted against it, believing they would only create problems, but she was outvoted. Over the next 2 days, everyone prepared for the coming attack, and the elves activated ancient defense systems and called up their warrior caste and practiced combat spells, and Kira spent hours with Ember and Frost running through aerial combat drills and coordination exercises. She saw the humans preparing as well, and they had established a command center in their main building and were coordinating with the Elven Defense Forces. And Kyle had organized his people into teams with specific responsibilities, and they worked with impressive efficiency, setting up medical stations and supply depots and communication relays. On the morning of the 3rd day the enemy arrived. The dimensional alarms went off across the planet as massive ships tore through the fabric of space and emerged in orbit, and there were dozens of them each, one bristling with weapons and strange technology, and Kira felt her heart sink because she had never seen vessels like these, and they radiated menace and power. The planetary shields activated automatically, forming a shimmering barrier over the U. Major population centers and the defense platforms opened fire with concentrated energy beams, and the Elven fleet that had returned during the night engaged the enemy ships in orbit, but the invaders called themselves the Krathor, as they discovered from intercepted communications, and they had weapons that adapted and evolved with each attack. And the first wave of Elven magic that struck their shields was effective, but the second wave was less so. And by the 3rd wave, the Krathor shields had completely adjusted and the attacks bounced off harmlessly. The enemy began bombarding the planetary shields with a weapon that generated cascading energy pulses, and Kira watched in horror as the shields flickered and weakened, and within an hour the first shield generator failed and Krathor dropships began descending toward the surface. Kira mounted Ember and took to the air with Frost beside her and all across the planet. Other dragon riders did the same, and they formed up in squadrons and prepared to engage the invading forces, and she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline and the cold certainty that this would be a fight unlike any she had experienced before. The Krathor soldiers that emerged from the dropships wore heavy armor and carried weapons that crackled with purple energy, and they moved in organized units spreading out from their landing zones with military precision, and the Elven warriors engaged them with magic and blade, and Claw Kira dove from above with Ember, unleashing a torrent of flame on a cluster of Krathor soldiers, and the fire engulfed them completely. And for a moment she thought it had worked, but then the smoke cleared, and the soldiers were still standing, and their armor had protected them, and they raised their weapons and fired back. Purple energy bolts streaked through the air, and one of them caught Frost on her wing, and the silver dragon screamed in pain and faltered in flight, and Kira felt the agony through their bond, and rage filled her as she directed Ember to attack again. But more Krathor soldiers emerged from the dropships and more weapons fired, and all around her she saw Elven warriors falling, and dragons wounded and retreating, and the enemy advanced, steadily pushing deeper into Elven territory. She saw the human settlement in the distance and expected to see them evacuating or hiding, but instead she saw them taking up defensive positions, and Kyle was directing his people, and they had set up their primitive, ballistic weapons and were preparing to fight. Foolish, she thought, and they will be slaughtered. But then the Krathor reached the humans' position, and the humans opened fire, and the sound was deafening and continuous, and Kira saw Krathor soldiers stumbling and falling, and their adaptive shields seemed less effective against the kinetic projectiles. The humans were using, Kyle was in the thick of it, firing his weapon with precise controlled bursts and shouting orders to his team, and Lisa was beside him providing cover fire, and Danny was coordinating with other groups through his radio, and Amy was moving between positions, distributing ammunition and treating wounded. A group of Krathor soldiers broke through the elven lines and were heading toward a shelter full of civilians, and Kira was too far away to intercept, and she screamed in frustration. But then Jake Morrison stepped out with something that looked like a tube on his shoulder, and he fired it, and a rocket streaked across the battlefield and exploded among the Krathor soldiers, stopping their advance. The battle raged for hours, and Kira fought until her magic was nearly exhausted, and Ember was covered in burns and scratches, and Frost could barely fly with her damaged wing, and all around the situation was growing desperate, because the Krathor kept coming and their technology kept adapting, and the elven forces were being pushed back. And through it all, she kept seeing the humans fighting with everything they had and never retreating and never giving up, even though they were outmatched and outgunned and facing an enemy far beyond their experience. The sun was setting on the first day of battle, and Kira was exhausted beyond anything she had ever experienced, and her magic reserves were dangerously low, and both Ember and Frost were wounded and struggling. But the Krathor showed no signs of stopping, and more dropships continued to descend from orbit, bringing fresh soldiers and weapons. She had just finished driving back a squad of Krathor from the eastern ridge when she received a mental distress call from another dragon rider, and she urged Ember toward the source and found 3 Krathor fighters pursuing an injured dragon and its young rider. And the fighters were sleek aircraft bristling with weapons, and they were firing continuously at the fleeing dragon Kira Dove to intercept breathing commands to Ember through their bond, and the red dragon responded despite his exhaustion, and unleashed a massive flame burst that caught one of the fighters and sent it spiraling to the ground, and Frost, despite her wounded wing, managed to freeze the engines of a second fighter, causing it to crash. But the third fighter turned toward them and fired a sustained energy beam, and the shot caught Ember directly in the chest, and Kira felt her dragon's pain explode through their bond. And suddenly they were falling, and the ground rushed up at impossible speed, and she tried to slow their descent with levitation magic, but her reserves were too depleted. They hit hard, and Kira felt bones break and pain blossom through. Her left side and her wing crumpled beneath her, and she tasted blood, and Ember lay motionless beside her, breathing but barely conscious, and Frost tried to land nearby, but another blast from the fighter struck her and sent her tumbling away across the rocky ground. Kira tried to move, but agony shot through her ribs and her vision blurred, and she heard the distinctive sound of Krathor boots approaching, and through the haze she saw soldiers surrounding her position and their weapons humming as they powered up for the killing shots. This was it then, she thought, and after 3,000 years of life she would die here at the hands of an enemy she did not understand, and fighting a battle she had not expected, and she closed her eyes, accepting her fate because there was no escape and no help coming. Then she heard different sounds and the crack of human weapons firing in rapid succession and shouting in that human language, and she forced her eyes open and saw Kyle Matthews charging toward her position with his squad behind him, and they were firing as they ran and putting themselves directly between her and the Krathor soldiers. "What are you doing?" she tried to shout, but her voice came out as a whisper. "And you cannot win, and run, you fools, run." But Kyle did not run, and none of his people ran, and they took cover behind rocks and kept firing, and Lisa threw something that exploded in a burst of electromagnetic energy, and the Krathor shields flickered and died, and in that moment Jake fired a rocket that took out 2 soldiers, and Danny was providing covering fire while Amy moved forward, trying to reach Kira more. Krathor arrived, and the humans were outnumbered 10-1. But they held their ground, and Kyle took a plasma burn to his shoulder, and she saw him stagger, but he kept fighting, and Lisa nearly lost her leg to an energy blade. But still she dragged herself toward cover and maintained fire, and these fragile, short-lived humans were fighting. Like warriors from legend, Amy reached Kira and immediately began assessing her injuries, and she pulled out a medical kit and started working, and her hands were steady despite the chaos around them, and she spoke in calm, measured tones explaining what she was doing. "You need to leave, Kira. Gasped and save yourselves. We are not leaving you," Amy said firmly while injecting something that dulled the pain, and humans do not abandon people. And that is not what we do. More humans arrived and reinforcements from the settlement, and they brought heavier weapons, and Danny Rivera set up what looked like a large mounted gun and began providing suppressing fire that forced the Krathor to take cover, and Kyle coordinated the defense with quick, precise orders, and his people responded with the kind of discipline that came from extensive training. One of the humans, named Tony Ruiz, ran out into the open to grab a wounded comrade, and he took 3 hits to his armor but kept going and pulled the other human back to safety. And another human named Nina Foster provided sniper fire from a high position, taking out Krathor soldiers who tried to flank their position. The firefight was brutal and intense, and Kira had never seen anything like it, because the humans fought with a ferocity that seemed impossible for creatures so physically weak, and they used tactics and coordination and an absolute refusal to yield that reminded her of the ancient stories of elven heroes from thousands of years ago. Ember stirred beside her, and Kira reached out mentally to check on him, and he was badly hurt, but alive and responding to her touch through their bond, and she could feel Frost in the distance, also wounded but conscious and trying to make her way back. To them, Kyle took another hit, and this time his leg buckled and he went down hard. But Lisa was there immediately helping him to cover while maintaining fire with one hand, and she was bleeding from a cut on her forehead. But her aim never wavered. The battle seemed to last forever, but was probably only minutes, and gradually the Krathor began to pull back, because they had not expected such fierce resistance from this position, and they had lost too many soldiers, and the humans had proven more dangerous than anticipated. When the enemy finally retreated, Kyle collapsed against a rock, breathing hard and holding his wounded leg, and his shoulder was still smoking from the plasma burn, and Amy immediately went to work on him while other humans secured the perimeter and checked on the wounded. "Why?" Kira asked when she found her voice, "and why did you do that?" "And you could have died." Kyle looked at her with those strange human eyes and managed a pained smile. "And because it was the right thing to do," he said. "And because you would have done the same for us." "No," Kira said honestly, "and I would not have. And I have treated you with nothing but contempt since you arrived, and I voted against your presence here. And I mocked your efforts and laughed at your weakness, and yet you risked your lives for me." Kyle shrugged and then winced from the pain the movement caused. "And maybe that says more about us than about you," he replied. "And we came here hoping to build bridges and to learn and to make friends, and sometimes you have to prove yourself through actions." Lisa limped over and sat down heavily, and she was holding pressure on her leg wound but grinned at Kira. "And besides," she said, "and those dragons are really cool, and we could not let anything happen to them despite everything." Kira felt herself smile, and it was a genuine smile, perhaps the first she had ever given to humans. "And thank you," she said. And the words felt inadequate, but she meant them with everything she had. The rest of the night passed in waves of fighting as the Krathor tested different positions, and the humans coordinated with the elven forces to hold the lines, and Kira watched from her position, unable to fight but learning, and she saw how the humans adapted to each new threat and how they supported each other and how they never gave up. Danny stayed by her side keeping watch, and at one point she asked him why he had come to her world, and he said, "Because I wanted to meet elves and see real magic and learn about a culture that has existed for thousands of years, and because I believe different species can learn from each other and make each other better." "Do you still believe that?" she asked. "And after seeing how we have treated you?" Danny nodded. "And yeah, I do. And you are not responsible for how your entire species acts, just like I am not. And individuals choose who they want to be. And right now, I choose to believe we can be friends." Kira thought about that for a long time, and throughout the night as the battle continued and as dawn approached, she realized something fundamental had changed in her, and these humans had risked everything for her, and had expected nothing in return, and they had shown more honor and courage than many elves she knew who had lived for centuries. When morning came, the Krathor had pulled back to regroup and consolidate their positions, and both sides used the lull to tend their wounded and prepare for the next assault. And Kyle came to check on Kira, and his leg was bandaged and he was limping badly, but still functional. "How are your dragons?" he asked. "They will live," Kira replied. "And thanks to you and your people, and I owe you a debt I can never repay." "You do not owe us anything," Kyle said. "And we are all in this together now." Kira looked at him and really looked at him for the first time, seeing past his humanity to the person beneath. "And you are right," she said. "And we are in this together. And I was wrong about your people and about you, and I am sorry." Kyle smiled, an apology accepted, and now let us figure out how to win this war.